This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghannam.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, we're in the midst of a fire NATO right now here in Northern California for our listeners and viewers of Arab Talk. Jamal and I continue to broadcast from our remote locations in Northern California, but in addition to the pandemic, we are also confronting a massive and catastrophic fire basically surrounding us in Northern California, to the north, to the east, and to the south. So the air quality here in Northern California is really bad. And in addition to all the fire evacuations that are going on right now, we're in the midst of the ongoing pandemic. So it's a very difficult time, but we'll continue to broadcast to our listeners and our viewers wherever they may be. We have a great show today, Jamal. We're going to be talking to Diana Buttu about I don't know what else to call it, the so-called Grand Peace Plan between the UAE, the Emirates, and the government of Israel. And we'll be getting Diana's take on that. And then after that, there's a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about the DNC. We're going to talk about Steve Bannon. We're going to talk about the Sudan and possible things going on diplomatically with the Israelis. And then we should talk a little bit about Linda Sarsour, Jamal, because she's been under attack. So it's an action-packed show.
That's right. We have a lot to talk about. Let's start by the interview with Diana Buttu. I spoke to her. She's in Palestine, and she's talking about the reaction, the aftermath of the so-called Israel-UAE peace deal. Basically that they've started that process now. So let's listen to her. Israel and the United Arab Emirates last Thursday announced what they refer to a historic deal to normalize relations, the first such move between Israel and an Arab state in many years. The UAE media and government officials say that the Gulf Emirate acted to stave off Israel from annexing more territory in the West Bank, the core of a possible future Palestinian state. Is this really what happened? Joining us from Palestine to discuss this and more, Diana Buttu, a Ramallah-based analyst and former legal advisor to Palestine Liberation Organization Chairman Mahmoud Abbas. Welcome again to Arab Talk, Diana.
Thank you very much, Jamal. Thanks for having me.
Is this a historic deal as it's been advertised? Is the United Arab Emirates helping the Palestinians, as they claim, by preventing a future annexation of large areas of the West Bank?
Well, let's deal with the second question first. Are they helping us? And the answer is no. In fact, they are hurting us. And I want to take you back a little bit in time, which is that since the early 90s, since 1993, the position that the PLO has taken has been one of bilateral negotiations. In other words, recognition and bilateral negotiations, despite the fact that we've seen that these negotiations have gone absolutely nowhere. And then in 2004, with the decision that came out from the International Court of Justice, it was the first time that we saw that there was a move towards pushing and holding Israel accountable. And of course, 1 year exactly after that decision came out was when the BDS movement was formed. Now, it's taken 15 years to get the PLO, PA on board with this boycott strategy. And we heard them announce in June of this year that they were actually pushing for sanctions against Israel for the first time ever. And so instead of the UAE supporting us and helping us and trying to help, whether you like civil society or don't, or whether you like the Palestinian Authority or don't, but it was united. Instead of them having a strategy in which they're supporting what Palestinians are saying we need, they instead turn around and have stabbed us in the back. And what they've done is they've not only normalized relations with Israel, but they've normalized relations with Israel in exchange for absolutely nothing. In the past, one could potentially argue that Egypt entered the agreement because they wanted to get back Egyptian territory. One can argue, can try, I wouldn't do well with it, to argue that the Jordanians followed suit in 94 because of the Oslo agreements and the promise of freedom. But here we have a promise of absolutely nothing. And instead, we see that the UAE is actually rewarding Israel for continuing its colonization, for continuing the occupation, rather than actually putting into place sanctions. And on top of that, harming us in the process. I can tell you that there will be a settlement announcement this week, Jamal. They haven't stopped anything. And immediately after this announcement was made, the UAE spin machine isn't as good as the Israeli spin machine. Immediately after the UAE made this announcement, Netanyahu turned to the Israeli press and said, who said that annexation is off the table? Absolutely, it's not off the table. So in other words, the UAE has stopped absolutely nothing. To get to your first question, is this historic? In a sense, yes, because we see that that although there had been this lead up in the past of having these relations that were under the table, we now get this sense in a very historic way that they don't even feel obliged to do anything towards Palestinians, that they did it without even informing the Palestinian Authority leadership. And in that sense, it is historic and it's unprecedented, and it vindicates the Netanyahu position that the Palestinians mean nothing to the Arab world.
Now, you've alluded to this because you're absolutely right. The Emiratis and their supporters in the media have been justifying their move on precedents. They're saying, if Egypt and Jordan can have normal relations with Israel, why not us? They're also saying if the Palestinian leadership has signed multiple agreements with Israel, why not us? Can you elaborate on this? I mean, why not?
Well, because I think it's important to keep these things in their historical perspective. Egypt, in exchange for its agreement, again, whether you like it or not like it, there are facts. They retrieved back the territory that Israel shouldn't have been occupying in the first place. And in the case of the Jordanians, really, their peace agreement came in large part to be able to facilitate Oslo and on the promise that somehow we were going to get a state. And then when it comes to the Palestinian Authority, look, we can disagree, and you know my position that I don't support the Oslo Accords, but we're people who are living under Israeli military rule. The UAE is not living under Israeli military rule, and so the fact that they are using these as precedents, and they're very weak precedents, to do what is otherwise a deal that is unprecedented. I mean, as the world is now moving towards holding these human rights abusers accountable, we have a country that's doing the exact opposite, that's actually rewarding them. That's the part that is so disturbing in all of this. And that part is not precedented. And it leaves me questioning what it is that the UAE gets out of it. I know what the US gets out of it, which is Trump can say that his diplomacy has worked, even though we've seen his diplomacy fail when it came to North Korea, when it's come to China, and when it's come to Iran. And Netanyahu, who's facing a corruption trial, who's facing massive protests in the streets, and potentially a fourth election, can now turn around and say, see, I got a peace agreement without having to give up anything. What's in it for the UAE still remains to be seen, other than security deals and arms deals, which were already happening under the table.
Now, Bahrain and Oman could be the next Gulf countries to follow the United Arab Emirates, formalizing ties with Israel. This is according to Israel's intelligence minister. This is what he said. In fact, the Israeli press has been floating 5 or more Arab countries that could be next: Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, Morocco, Sudan, and others. Is this wishful thinking on their part, or is it the end of, like you've mentioned, the behind doors or secret meetings, and Arabs are just going to line up to shake the hand of Benjamin Netanyahu?
I don't think it's wishful thinking. I think we are going to see a lot of this happen. Look, I think as we're coming close to the end of the the first 4 years of Trump, and we don't know what's going to happen in November. This is where I think that we're going to see a great deal of pressure brought to bear by the Trump administration on these regimes, on these governments to start working with Israel, to recognize Israel, and to collaborate with Israel. So I don't at all think it's wishful thinking. I think the bigger picture and the bigger question is, what is it that the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, is going to do about it? And, Jamal, these signs were in the making. This wasn't just a month or two. This was years of this style of cooperation, from everything from Miri Regev showing up in Abu Dhabi to having competitions in which Israelis were invited, to having other Israeli leaders in Abu Dhabi, to having flights, to being able to sell weapons from Israel to the Emirates. You all recall that the Mossad was in Dubai and did some assassinations back then. This isn't the first time that we see this level of cooperation. It didn't just happen overnight. And yet all throughout these years, the Palestinian Authority has had zero strategy when it comes to changing gears and potentially shifting gears to move towards something other than the bilateral negotiations, something other than hoping that a new U.S. president is somehow going to change the equation. And when Trump came into office, the Palestinian leadership was told this is not going to be the same president like every other president. He's going to go around you, and you have to think of ways that you're going to stop that.
You pretty much said it right. I mean, they've had all the writing on the wall, right? So what's next for the Palestinian leadership? They seem to be paralyzed. What you're describing, I mean, they've had all these signs and warnings, and they have done nothing. And then they just wait. All that I see is condemnation, be it annexation, the settlers, the killings of or the assassination of Palestinian children. Just condemnation after condemnation, no action has been taken.
I wish it even amounted to that, Jamal. I think that oftentimes we don't even hear the condemnations, and it becomes so commonplace. The sad part for me is that it feels as though time has stood still for this leadership. It's the same tactics that were used in the late 90s that are continuing to be used today in 2020. And although it's the same tactics, although it's different tactic, it's the same strategy. They haven't rethought the strategy. And you're right, they're left paralyzed. I think it's important to keep in mind, we're talking about between 100,000 to 350,000 Palestinians who are living in the United Arab Emirates. And these are people who send home money, remittance money. They send money to support Palestinian organizations. And there is a fear that they don't want to have another Kuwait exile, as we saw 30 years ago with Iraq and Kuwait, what happened in Kuwait. And so there's a fear, which is why their condemnation hasn't even really been a condemnation. It's been we support the people of the UAE and we disagree with this policy statement more than anything else. But what they should be seeing is that the writing is on the wall, and you're right, Bahrain, Oman, others are definitely lining up, and they still don't have an alternative strategy. They're still talking about the Palestinian Authority as though this is the year 1995. They're still dealing with bilateral negotiations and calling for bilateral negotiations as though it was 1994 or 95. And so this remains a huge problem, that unless there is a different vision, and I'm hoping that there is a different vision, we are really going to be facing a situation in which, and this is what the right wing wants in Israel, is that we're just turned into just another minority like other minorities in the Middle East, without any concern or without any touch or even recognition that we are living under colonial rule.
I mean, what about the people? Are they tired? They're just like overwhelmed with what's happening, especially now. They're suffering from the spread of the coronavirus, poor economy, high unemployment, and of course the occupation itself. People in the past kept saying, well, there might be a third intifada or people, and then of course this didn't happen. So are they just like I feel almost they are kind of they are numb, really. They are numb and they just keep getting disappointed, one disappointment after the other, one setback after the other, and are they just throwing the towel on this?
No, I don't think you'll ever see Palestinians throw in the towel. You've seen us and our strength and resilience, and it's something that we shouldn't have to be resilient. We shouldn't have to be strong. It's the fact that we've been pushed into this situation by the Israelis where we have to survive, and people are definitely going to do anything that they need to do to survive. But that being said, this has been not just a year; it's been decades of massive disappointment. When I think back, just even to my time in Palestine, I arrived on the promise that we were going to see freedom. For me, it was within a year, and here it is. We're nowhere even closer to any notion of freedom. We've been fed the lie that the Arab League and the Arab world is going to stand by us, and we see that that's crumbled as well. And then now add to this everything that's happening with the pandemic. The pandemic is we've got the double oppression of a pandemic plus the Israelis who are not only controlling the healthcare system, but controlling the economy. So as countries around the world are talking about packages that are compensation packages and assistance packages, we in Palestine, there is no such thing because we've just never been able to have anything other than be living off of either the support of the international donor community or waiting for our money to be transferred to us by the Israelis. And so here we have now, we've got skyrocketed unemployment. The Israelis are no longer allowing. It's not even a question of laborers or Palestinian work any longer. They've completely replaced Palestinian work. And you see now that they're doing everything in their power to bring us to our knees so that we then turn around and say, yes, living under occupation is better than living under the Palestinian Authority. And sadly, the policies of the Palestinian Authority have also largely contributed to this. When you're a young person who's under, let's say under 30, your entire life, your entire memory has been living under a combination of Israeli military rule, of checkpoints that were established under a peace agreement, a supposed peace agreement, path to peace agreement, excuse me. You've had to live under permits. All you've ever lived under is the military occupation with zero prospects that is ever going to change. And then add to this now the decision by the UAE to support your oppressor, to support your occupier. And you can see how everybody feels betrayed. And the fact that the UAE is also claiming that this is on our behalf is really one of the sickest propaganda messages that I've ever heard in my life.
Now, you've talked about what's in it for the UAE earlier, and we know Benjamin Netanyahu is a winner in this deal. We know that Donald Trump is a winner in this deal. We know that the Palestinians are losers, really, in this deal. We don't know about the UAE except doing more business, buying more weapons from the United States, getting protection against Iran. and other things. But when it comes to the Palestinian Authority, who's the loser there? I've read some rumors that, and I'm just attributing this to rumors on Israeli media, basically, that Mohammed Dahlan was on the Etihad Airways cargo plane that came to Tel Aviv in June and met with Netanyahu. So, and then there are kind of plans to replace Abbas with Dahlan. Are you buying such rumors?
No. I think if you step back and you analyze, especially what the UAE had to gain from all of this, the UAE didn't need to go down this path at all. It had everything that it wanted without doing the on the face recognition. And when they do the on the table recognition, there isn't a Palestinian who's going to come out and say, "I support this." And the Palestinian who does come out and say that he or she or they support this is going to be the person who's going to have the lowest amount of popularity and support. And so if the attempt was to somehow replace the Mahmoud Abbas leadership with a Dahlan leadership, this is definitely not the way to do it. This isn't going to buy him any favor or win him any votes or get any or persuade people. It's quite the opposite. It looks exactly as though he's the person who is weak, and that even he was unable, with his close ties, unable to stop the UAE from going down this path. A lot of that propaganda that tends to come out is propaganda that is designed to deflect from the mistakes that the PA has made. And they've made some very serious mistakes. For years, we've been seeing that the Israelis have opened up a path with a lot of these Arab states. And for years, the Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority were warned that this was going to be a different administration than in previous years. And they continue to pursue the same policies and the same strategy. So tomorrow, if, for example, Bahrain signs an agreement with Israel, there's no way that we can turn around and say that this was something that was done by Dahlan or the influence of Dahlan, because he doesn't have any influence in Bahrain. But what we can say is that it's the failure of the Palestinian Authority to really be pushing for a different strategy and to push back against this massive tsunami that the Trump administration has brought upon us. One thing that I think is also important to keep in mind in all of this is that we're now at a point, I feel like we've come very much full circle, where the world, everybody else is speaking on our behalf. We have the UAE saying that they're doing this on our behalf. We have the Trump plan that says that they're doing things on our behalf. The Israelis come forward and say, this is better for you. It's on your behalf. And we fought so much. I mean, people lost their lives just to be able to have our own voice and have our own say. And here we are now, rather than taking that voice and having that say, instead we are hiding and somehow saying that it's something other than it really is, which is it's poor leadership. It's poor leadership.
The only thing that has been working for the past few years is really BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Israel. I mean, we've seen this, people who are living at least in the diaspora, we've kind of witnessed the pressure within the US Congress to, attack BDS and so forth. Benjamin Netanyahu called it an existential threat to the state of Israel. And now we see this normalization. Is this going to hurt BDS? Or are people going to differentiate between government actions? Like I was thinking, okay, well, the UAE can normalize, but the people don't have to normalize.
This is going to be the big test now, Shaman. Look, I think in terms of the BDS, anything that where people are normalizing with Israel is obviously it's a setback, but it's not a setback in the sense that as we might see countries like UAE normalizing, we see more and more people who are saying this is absolutely absurd, and we instead should be boycotting. And that being said, I think that a lot of the focus that the BDS movement has had over the years has been to really revitalize and make sure that there are active BDS campaigns throughout the Arab world. For example, I know there's a very strong one that's in Kuwait. There's others that are in Qatar. There's active BDS movements, and they need to obviously become much more active. For me, the test is going to be whether we see Emiratis here coming to visit.
The Israeli president today, Revlin, invited the emir to come and visit Jerusalem.
Yes, and beyond that, I'm more concerned with the non-governmental officials coming to visit. I mean, I've been seeing these and watching in horror on social media as many Emiratis are coming forward and saying that they're going to come and finally pray in Al-Aqsa, of course, putting a picture of the Dome of the Rock, but let's leave that as a different issue altogether. And there has been this push against to have normalization in the sphere of religion. So the real question for me is going to be whether Emiratis, not people who are affiliated with the government, whether they respect, and I hope they do respect, the boycott call, and that they don't go down the path of in any way normalizing with Israel.
I want to thank you, Diana, again for coming on Arab Talk, and really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you soon. Thank
you. Thank you very much, Shaman. I appreciate it.
Well, that was the voice of Diana Buttu, actually former spokesperson for the Palestinian Authority many years ago, and now
Palestine Liberation Organization, actually.
Yeah, and she gives a very cogent, not very optimistic analysis about this peace deal, Jamal. So-called peace deal.
Well, I don't think there is any optimism anywhere. We saw the reaction from Palestinians, whether official reactions or from the public, and also a lot of decry from the Palestinian diaspora and Arabs across the world. Now, having said that, as you've listened to Diana, she said that this is just the beginning. She has a lot of concerns, a lot of worry. And since, the Israelis, they have been teasing the idea that sometimes they'll say Bahrain is going to be next or Oman is going to be next. And recently they've been saying that Saudi Arabia is going to be next. And now we know for example, that Sudan Foreign Ministry spokesperson Haidar Badawi Sadiq told Sky News that Sky News Arabia, so that's in Arabic, on Tuesday, that Sudan, and I'm quoting, aspires towards a peace agreement with Israel, a relationship of equals built upon Khartoum's interests. There is no reason for the enmity to continue, he said. We don't deny the communication between the two countries. So they're saying basically they've been talking for a while. And this is what happened with the UAE. Everybody knew that the UAE has been talking to Israelis. They've had exchanges. And a UAE airliner went to Tel Aviv. They've been meeting in Dubai. They've been meeting in London, everywhere. So it's not something new. But here is what's new now. We're getting these tidbits about the background. All of a sudden, recently, we've been seeing that, guess what? The UAE-Israel ties may get Abu Dhabi advanced weapons from the United States.
Yes.
That's the headline. So, as you know, the UAE said or issued a very disingenuous statement that they're doing it for the interest of the Palestinians because they want to stop Netanyahu from annexing more, West Bank land. I mean, in fact, they are saving Netanyahu because we know his annexation plan has failed. So they're bailing him out. And this was totally disingenuous. Instead of like saying, like, what Sudan? Okay, we're going to talk, whatever. We have common interests. I don't know what. But now we're finding out that Israel's, they hope that Israel will facilitate more advanced weapons from the United States or will not object.
But Israel has objected to this, Jamal.
Israel has objected. And not only this, Netanyahu said, well, we're just putting the annexation on hold. It's not off the table. It's just like we're delaying it.
Well, in fact, Jared Kushner said the same thing, Jamal. Jared Kushner said this week that they were going to suspend, we don't know for how long, the annexation.
So as a rule, Israel always opposes the sale of any advanced weapon, be it this time, by the way, the F-35s and other advanced weapon to any country, not that just the UAE, any country in the Middle East to maintain what it calls its qualitative military edge. And this, by the way, includes countries that signed peace agreements with Israel, like Egypt and Jordan. So even when Egypt requests to have parity with Israel, to have the same F-35s, even if they get the same F-35s, they are a generation or two, or they don't get all the avionics or all the electronics and whatever. They never ever get the same level of weapons. So this has been the standard, and then supposedly Trump has promised, and of course we know where Trump's promises go to. He promised the UAE, along with other pressures, putting the pressure on the emir there, and saying, you gotta move ahead, you gotta, because he wants, to go to the convention, which is next week, and say, people are gonna ask him, what happened to the deal of the century? And he say, we started the deal of the century. Look what happened between the UAE and Israel. And he's been flaunting the idea of Saudi Arabia's next. Even when Saudi Arabia issued a statement denying that they will be next, he said, no. I believe that Saudi Arabia is ready to go through. So we know this whole game. Anyway, this was a great interview with Diana Buttu. She spoke about, of course, how it affected there and how the Palestinians, to put it bluntly, feel stabbed in the back.
Well, yet again, Jamal, we have the Palestinians being thrown under the bus by monarchs and rulers in the Middle East and Arab world who have no interest in justice or bringing any kind of true peace to Palestine. This is a really tragic and sad a deal that was struck between the UAE and the Israelis. Tom Cotton, one of the senators, U.S. senators, said, this is a great deal because, and I'm paraphrasing, almost quoting Tom Cotton, saying, this is a great deal because it'll mean more arms sales. So militarizing even further already heavily militarized Arab world and Middle East is, arguably not the best thing in the world.
Hey, the Middle East does not need anything but weapons.
They don't weapons.
They don't need to agriculture. They don't need water. They don't
need just
to
more
preserve,
weapons.
The environment. It's all about the
weaponry,
the weaponry, and the military-industrial complex. Really putting some money.
And it was as usual, Jamal. It was great to hear Jared Kushner touting what a great agreement this was between the UAE and the Israelis, and saying, when asked about Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Arab countries, he said, it's difficult to turn a battleship around. Nothing really good is going to come out of this in terms of what's happening on the ground, either for Palestinians or for Arabs and people of the Middle East. Really, this is part of the larger thing that we've been talking about, is this proxy war between countries that are aligned with the United States and the Israelis, and countries that are not aligned with them and who may be more supportive of Iran. And the United States had a major diplomatic blow this week when the United Nations Security Council failed to ratify the ongoing sanctions against military aid to the Iranians. So Donald Trump and his administration, Jamal, they keep failing on all these diplomatic fronts, whether it be Palestine, whether it be the United Nations, whether it be Iran. It's really, and I hate to say this, Jamal, but the next 5 months could bring, especially as Donald Trump feels more boxed into a corner, could bring more catastrophic diplomatic failures that could cause great harm, not just to Palestine, but to the people of the entire world.
Well, talking about Donald Trump, we'll see what will happen next week. We will be watching closely the Republicans' convention, but apparently Donald Trump was watching the DNC, especially yesterday, and especially when former President Barack Obama offered some of his pointed, I would say, criticism of Trump and his administration. And
from Philadelphia, by the way, yeah.
I was watching this and I saw President Trump immediately tweeting all in caps, screaming at you, He spied on my campaign and got caught. That was, he had no answer, basically, to Obama's argument about him. And of course, we know that Trump's claim about the spying is not accurate. About the FBI during his time in office that they spied on him. This was debunked, but he keeps going to this. And I thought, and I don't know how you feel, but whether you agree with Barack Obama or you don't, but he really,
Well, it
I don't
was
know
a
if I can say what I wanted to say. But,
no, but he took him. It was a takedown. It was a big takedown.
He ripped him a new one.
Yeah, he did. I mean, Barack Obama, as well as Michelle Obama, did in the most elegant way you could of a sitting president completely dismantle anything that any argument one could make, let alone, Donald Trump or the Republicans could make for reelecting Donald Trump. I mean, basically, it was, I know what you wanted to say in terms of ripping him a new one, but it was a complete intellectual takedown of Donald Trump and his administration. Of course, it was lost on nobody, and, that he gave this talk from, Philadelphia, the birth of the the Declaration of the Independence and the Constitution. So many people made the argument that we're in, this is like a constitutional crisis if Donald Trump were to be elected again. Not a good week for Donald Trump, Jamal. A court today basically ruled that he could no longer keep his tax returns withheld from the Manhattan District Attorney. So those are going to have to be released. They've exhausted all appeals unless they decide to go to the Supreme Court, which is unlikely. And Donald Trump's advisor, Jamal, we have to talk about this. Steve Bannon is going to get indicted and arrested for fraud. This is basically... Oh, we forgot the Senate. The Senate completed its report on Russian interference and basically concluded and supported almost everything that the Mueller report did. So basically, Jamal, this has not been a great week for Donald Trump.
Has not. But, just a reminder about Steve Bannon. I hope everyone remembers who is Steve Bannon and his role in getting Donald Trump elected. But guess what? I just watched just a few minutes ago, or maybe about an hour ago, press conference with the president, who, as usual, I knew him very little. He always the guy helped you your entire journey to the White House. He only worked here for a little bit. I didn't like what they were doing. Immediately
threw him under the bus.
Threw him under the bus totally. Like he's a casual acquaintance of him. I mean, right. Donald Trump always challenges the American, basically, memory. Like, he thinks that everyone just will forget everything and anything about him within days, if not minutes.
Well, no one's going to forget about this, Jamal. The report from the Senate committee investigating Russian interference completely condemned, Paul Manafort and his relationship with Kalemnik, a Russian intelligent operative. Steve Bannon. This is a huge indictment against Steve Bannon. Most likely will have to do some prison time.
So who's going to pay for the wall, Jess?
Well, it looks like private donations are going to pay for the wall yet again, Jamal.
It was Mexico, but listen to this. I was reading about the indictment, So Steve Bannon, along with 3 other accomplices. They've had this. They've had a scheme. They've had 2 non-profit organizations. One transferring money to the other to kind of cover the trail of the money. Supposedly to raise millions of dollars. They had a goal, $30 million, to help build part of the Trump's wall, which he promised that Mexico was going to pay for it. And Steve Bannon said, no, we'll have the American people, not taxpayers' money. We will reach out to donors and so forth. So they've been collecting money to donate it eventually for the effort of building that wall. I think their goal was $25 million, not $30 million. So therefore, of course, I was looking at their indictment. They've been using hundreds of thousands of dollars, close to $1 million, on themselves. They were basically transferring the donations to another through another nonprofit under their control, using $1 million of the donation secretly to pay for one of the accomplices, Colfage, his name. To cover hundreds of thousands of dollars of Bannon's personal expenses. And according to the charges, this other accomplice, Colfage, spent more than $350,000 of the donations on personal expenses. Guess what? Including cosmetic surgery.
Wow.
Including cosmetic surgery.
Okay.
A luxury SUV.
Of course.
A golf cart.
Yes.
Payments towards a boat he purchased, his own personal home renovations, jewelry for himself or his wife or his girlfriend, I don't know who else, and paid his personal tax payments from it.
This doesn't
and paid off some credit card debt.
This doesn't sound like the wall to me, Jamal. This doesn't sound like the money was going to build the Great Wall of Trump. It sounds like, yet again, with the Trump administration, it's one big shell game of money going from one place to the other and not to where it was intended. I think one of the things that we're going to see, Jamal, as we get closer to the election in November, more of these illegalities are going to be coming out. We have the district attorney in New York who is getting ready to file some big charges that we can only speculate what it's going to be about, but he's now going to have access to Donald Trump's tax returns.
That's why Donald Trump moved his legal address to Florida. So we know
that's right.
In preparation.
And of course, Donald Trump decided that he would vote by mail, despite condemning everybody else who wanted to maybe vote against him, to vote by mail. So only if you're a Republican, are you allowed to vote by mail.
So these are just quickly the charges for these
what
folks.
are the charges, Jamal?
And their names. Brian Colfage is one, and of course Bannon, and then the 2 other defendants, Andrew Badalota and Timothy Shea.
Okay.
They're all charged with 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit money laundering. So that's where they're going. That's why, by the way, Bannon was arrested on his boat. I don't know how he paid for that boat. So hopefully it's not also from the money, But that's how he got arrested.
Okay.
So Trump, just quickly, Well, I'm just quoting again. I feel very badly. I haven't been dealing with him for a long period of time. He was involved in our campaign and for a small part of the administration very early on. That's the official statement from Donald Trump.
People who know will say that the intellectual brains behind getting Donald Trump not reelected, pardon the Freudian slip, getting Donald Trump elected with the Southern strategy, the white grievance strategy, came directly from Steve Bannon himself. Well, I don't know if he's going to be able to direct the Trump re-election bid from prison, Jamal, but it sounds like Steve Bannon is probably in for a world of hurt. Paul Manafort, this report from the Senate was very, very damning. And General Flynn looks like he's going to not get his charges thrown out after all. So it looks
and Cohen, his personal attorney, he is briefly out of jail because of the COVID, and he has a book. I haven't been able to look at the book yet, but I'm sure there's a lot of things that we could talk about in that book.
Maybe this is a good time to talk about Barack Obama's speech was great. Michelle Obama's speech was great. A lot of the speeches were very good, Jamal. But I am concerned that people are not taking seriously. I say this every week. I'm going to keep saying it. People are really underestimating the power of this person, Donald Trump, and the white grievance kind of movement in this country to win this election again. So,
that's why Biden needs every single vote, especially in in swing states like your home state of Michigan.
Yeah,
and that's why maybe we should talk briefly about what happened to Linda Sarsour, and that's going to alienate Arab Americans and
even
Muslim
more
Americans in this country.
Right.
And they're very much needed in these swing states, Michigan, Florida, and others. So the Joe Biden's campaign, we haven't heard from Joe Biden himself, but the Joe Biden's campaign has disavowed Palestinian American activist Linda Sarsour after she appeared at the Muslim Delegates and Allies Assembly side event to the Democratic National Convention. So on Tuesday, the Biden campaign attacked Sarsour over her because, people questioned that. Of course, we know who are those people who have been attacking her for a long time, and attacked Sarsour over her support for the BDS movement, right?
That's right.
The BDS, we've been talking about it. And so immediately, the spokesperson for the one of the I don't know if he's the main spokesperson. He's a campaign spokesperson. Andy Bates, his name,
right.
Told CNN Joe Biden has been a strong supporter of Israel and a vehement opponent of anti-Semitism his entire life, and he obviously condemns her views and opposes BDS, as does the Democratic platform. She has no role in the Biden campaign whatsoever. I mean,
okay.
Look,
at your peril, Joe Biden, and they're making the same mistake that they did in 2016, Jamal. They're going to alienate progressive forces. They've already began to they did some alienation with AOC, the kind of negative attacks on AOC by Democrats after she gave her 60-minute speech at the DNC.
She was following protocol. Convention protocol, nominating who? Bernie Sanders. That's
right.
Who she was. This is a protocol. She doesn't have to say anything about Biden.
Right, but my point is that the Democrats, and we know who's behind it, it's really the J Street, AIPAC Light, pro-Israel supporters who are coming out and trying to marginalize and trying to criticize and keep out of the equation progressive elements within the Democratic Party. And look at who it is, Jamal. It's women of color. So alienating women of color in the 2020 campaign, I don't think that's such a great idea.
Well, they're putting the facade of women of color because they have many of them presenting and talking and whatever, they were women of color. But they are alienating a segment of those who oppose that democratic establishment guidelines.
I say at your peril, Joe Biden.
And here's a funny thing I'm just going to tell you. Yesterday, on Wednesday, the DNC aired a video titled America Rising Women's Suffrage to Women's March, featuring footage of the movement that Linda Sarsour co-founded. Yes, she was part of the movement. She tweeted in response, and I'm quoting from her Twitter account, when the DNC uses footage of my labor at the Women's March to make themselves seem relevant while throwing my communities under the bus, you can't make this up. By the way, I've invited Linda Sarsour to come on the show. We haven't heard back from her. We also reached out to CARE, who issued a statement denouncing Biden's campaign. I haven't heard back, so hopefully she can come on this show next week and clarify her position.
Well, it's just so ironic because at the Women's March after the Trump inauguration, Linda Sarsour was one of the three co-chairs of that Women's March. She not only co-chaired it, but as she rightly pointed out, was one of the driving forces behind it. I'm sorry to sound repetitive, Jamal, but it sounds like the Democrats yet again could be shooting themselves in the foot, and the blind support for apartheid Israel policies are going to potentially cause grave damage to progressive forces within the Democratic Party yet again, Jamal. So I don't think they're going to wake up to see how potentially damaging this is. Criticizing AOC, criticizing Linda Sarsour, criticizing people who, on the Democratic platform believe that there should be a more just representation for Palestine in the BDS movement. It's not a great strategy, guys.
No, it's not. And I've already heard back from people I've been monitoring, on my Facebook page and on Twitter. Some of the comments, a lot of Arab Americans, Muslim Americans have been putting down like, oh, I'm not voting. And we've discussed this before, and we've had James Zogby on the show, and he said he's against that. Sometimes you have to hold your nose and vote, but people are not buying this. And instead of mitigating this, instead of just remaining silent, the campaign has to kind of like stab them again in the back and show them, basically tells them that your votes don't count. And as I've mentioned, Biden, if he needs to win, it's the same game. Vote. It's going to be, he needs the votes in these swing states. Arab Americans, Muslim Americans live in these swing states. I haven't, for example, seen him inviting our congresswoman, Ilhan Omar, or Rashida Tlaib. I mean, wouldn't you want to show the diversity? Because we talk about diversity. Wouldn't he? I'm waiting. So I'm not gonna pass judgment. It's the last days today, probably.
No, Jamal. I have breaking news. They're not going to
send a message to all the different communities, because they're trying to send a message of diversity, African Americans, the Latinx community, and LGBTQ and so forth. Wouldn't you want to send a message to the Muslim community in the United States that you have a big enough tent to include them under it?
No, because this is the fake liberal policies of the Democrats. This is what has gotten them in trouble in the past. It's going to get them in trouble in the future, and I don't think that they're going to be wise enough to bring Congresswoman Omar or Congresswoman Tlaib, to speak even for 5 seconds during the DNC, because
just even a short photo up.
I don't think it's going to happen. Jamal, the DNC has been hijacked by liberal Zionist forces, and
by the way, to be accurate, in the the B-roll that they showed before the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, spoke, they had a bunch of pictures with her, mostly women, because her focus is on women. And then they showed the Time magazine cover with her posing with the squad. That's the only picture that I actually, just for a split of a second, there was that glance of them there.
Okay, I don't call that showcasing, you know.
I just want to be accurate.
Okay, you could be accurate, but it's not going far enough by far. Well, it looks like we've come to another close of Arab Talk, Jamal. We have a lot to talk about. We're sending our concerns and deep worry to our community here in Northern California because the fires continue to rage out of control. We have rolling blackouts here in Northern California, all of California, not just Northern California. And the next 24 to 48 hours are going to be very difficult. So we send our prayers and our worries and our concerns to all of our communities here in California, and be careful. We didn't even get a chance to talk about the coronavirus. I'll just say one thing really quick, Jamal. To Governor DeSantis in Florida, who opened up all those schools, and Governor Kemp, who opened up all those schools, we're seeing massive school closures now for those schools that opened up. Universities are now closing to on-site education and going fully, online. So the rush to open schools, it looks like, Jamal, has been a complete failure. So we'll know more in a couple of weeks.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. We also welcome our viewers on Facebook and on YouTube. We will talk to you next week. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download or watch or listen the latest podcasts.
We'll see you next week.